2 o'clock. Welcome everyone to today's session on Taiwan-Lithuania relations, which I guess could not be more timely, given that you in Lithuania just had a meeting from Eric Wang, one of the key Taiwanese parliamentarians in charge of trade, working out a proposal on semiconductors and collaboration between Taiwan and Lithuania. So before I give away too much, I would welcome Dr. Konstantinas Andrijauskas, who is an associate professor of Asian Studies and International Politics at Vilnius University in Lithuania. He received his doctoral degree in 2014 with a thesis on Sino-Russian relations, which will feature today, I assume, and was formerly a visiting scholar at China's Fudan and Zhejiang universities, as well as Columbia University. So without further ado, I would give the floor to you, Konstantinas, and you can share your slides.
Thank you very much, Larissa. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor for me to be with you this beautiful and sunny morning, afternoon, excuse me, at least in Vilnius and Stockholm, as I have been told. And indeed, I do have slides that I want to share with you. I'm just going to do that in a second or so. Yeah, and these should be available by now. So I have been told that I've got only some 20 minutes or so. So throughout this relatively compact period, I'm going to focus on, I would argue, the key developments associated with Lithuania, Taiwan, China triangle, so to speak, throughout these last several years, particularly since the year 2019. And I would argue that it is probably the best for us to leave the most curious topics for the Q&A session, because I would definitely assume that a pretty substantial part of the auditorium is pretty well versed in the actual question that we are raising today. So Taiwan and Lithuania defying the odds, and let us start with several things that I wanted to emphasize particularly, and on top you can see the points that I'm basically raising and that I attempt to defend in this regard. And the point number 2 is that the Taiwanese move is merely part of a larger trend in terms of the shift, a pretty clear-cut shift in Sino-Lithuanian relationship in general. So this is something that probably quite a lot of you would know pretty well, but we have to emphasize in this regard that the whole shift in Sino-Lithuanian relations actually started back in 2019, which proved to be in many ways a watershed year in terms of this particular bilateral relationship. And that year, the lunar year, actually, at that time it coincided with the beginning of February, started rather inauspiciously when the security agencies of Lithuania declared China as a threat to the country's national security for the first time. And thus China, in effect, joined the usual suspects of Russia and Belarus. And only half a year later, a very nasty incident erupted in downtown Vilnius, in the capital of Lithuania, when, well, in effect, pro-Hong Kong protest was disrupted by the pro-Beijing counter-protesting group that also was composed of, well, basically the who's who of the pro-Beijing part of the Chinese diaspora community in Lithuania. And that counter-protesting group included the Chinese diplomats, which obviously was a breach of the Vienna Convention. And this whole event, in effect, caused a certain chill in the political side of the bilateral relationship, while in terms of the economic component of bilateral relationship between China and Lithuania, there were several record years, 2018, 19, and 20 even, in which the trade data in particular showed a very substantial rise. So contrary to the economic promises, so to speak, the political problems that that were rather apparent by the end of the year 2019, they in essence caused a certain cooling period in the relationship in general that obviously lasted till the start of the pandemic in early spring the following year. You can see a picture from our mass media that depicts this actual commotion between the pro-Hong Kongese group that also included prominent Lithuanian politicians that would later become very important in terms of the review of the country's relationship with China and in terms of actually building stronger bridges with Taiwan as well. And you can see that there are also the counter protesters waving quite obviously the flags of the People's Republic of China here as well. The second point, if we would follow chronologically in this regard, with the emphasis on the following year, the year 2002, is that the Taiwan Move, and basically this is something that is primarily associated with the year 2021, with the whole story about the so-called Taiwanese representative office. But we have to remember that the whole move towards establishing better de facto relations, better links with Taiwan, it actually started in early 2020, and the key reason behind that was the COVID-19 pandemic, or to be more precise, the first wave of the pandemic that obviously erupted in spring of that year across both Asia and Europe. And back then, Lithuania commended Taiwan's whistleblowing efforts vis-a-vis the outbreak of, at that time, epidemic in China. Lithuania took a particular interest in the apparent Taiwanese success story in terms of actually dealing with the pandemic, or its first wave to be more precise. And even more importantly, in this regard, the Taiwanese actually initiated their own mass diplomacy towards the Baltic states in general, and Lithuania in particular, around the same time, admittedly, as the People's Republic did the same. So quite a lot of Lithuanians, they were genuinely thankful for the Taiwanese help in that pretty dire and troublesome period for us as well. And as a result of that, some 200 members of the academic community in general, public figures of more visible stature in Lithuania, they composed and signed a public letter to Lithuania's president. And the main goal was to actually increase support for Taiwan in its dispute with the People's Republic of China at the World Health Assembly. So basically, the signatories to the letter, they asked the president for his support in terms of the actual need to deal with the repercussions of the pandemic. And somewhat later, also as a result of this development, our then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Linas Linkevičius, actually on his own personal initiative contacted Dr. Ghebreyesus, the head of the World Health Organization, and advocated for Taiwan's inclusion at the upcoming World Health Assembly. And probably the vast majority of you know very well, eventually Beijing decided not to allow this to happen. And this was obviously a pretty unfortunate development, considering yet again that Taiwan had this very important experience and a very good record of actually tackling the issue, which at that time was of utmost importance. Well, throughout the whole world, one would argue. The important thing to mention in this regard, and this is a thing that is not widely known, even in this country, even Lithuania, is actually that in response to this initiative by the then Foreign Minister of Lithuania, China actually put trade restrictions on our wheat exports to the country, and the whole thing was not really made public back in the day. But we have to emphasize that the Chinese, in effect, started their economic statecraft campaign, though in a low-scale manner, even before the whole Taiwanese representative office thing that obviously erupted more than a year later. So this is a thing that we have to keep in mind as well. In the later half, in the second half of that year, the Taiwan agenda entered an electoral cycle of the country's politics back in the day, because Lithuania was readying itself for the upcoming general elections, for the upcoming parliamentary elections in the country. And in the beginning of summer, an op-ed was published in one of the country's most important media outlets, and it was authored by Gabrielius Landsbergis and Mantas Adomėnas. You could see Mantas Adomėnas depicted in the previous picture during the pro-Hong Kongese demonstration in downtown Vilnius and central Vilnius. And both of these two politicians happen to be key figures within the country's larger center-right political party. So this was an important thing. So the op-ed, in effect, amounted to their own, and by extension their political party's program on the review, on the necessity of the review of Lithuania's relationship with China. And Taiwan proved to be a very important component within that call for the actual general review of the relationship, and thus Taiwan entered the Lithuanian electoral cycle, though not that much the actual debates, which focused on other issues such as tackling the issue of the pandemic, tackling the somewhat later on tackling the electoral and political crisis in Belarus as well, since the second half of August as well. So the Taiwanese issue was somewhat sidelined by those more important allegedly developments back in the day, at least in short-term perspective. Only several days afterwards, after this op-ed, the Taiwanese representative to the Baltic states was actually giving a stage in the country's parliament called the Seimas, again at the invitation of the same political force of that particular center-right political party, and it turned to be rather apparent that normalization of the relationships with the Taiwanese was very much in the air already at that time. By the end of summer, the Lithuanian members of parliament, not all of them obviously, but a very substantial number of those, and Lithuanian members of the European Parliament as well, supported Miloš Vystrčil, the then head of the Senate of the Czech Republic, in his country's dispute with China. And again, Taiwan was a very important part of the story, because yet again, Miloš Vystrčil actually visited the island back then, causing a pretty nasty dispute with Beijing, and thus the then Czech authorities, particularly the parliament, particularly the Senate, particularly the city of Prague, which had their own dispute, the capital city of the Czech Republic, they also attempted to gather as much of support as possible in terms of their disagreements with Beijing back in the day, and Lithuania proved to be very active in this regard as well. In the beginning of autumn of that same year, Lithuania-Taiwan Forum was established, which, and this was not a political, but more of a kind of societal and cultural initiative, but yet again, the Taiwanese profile was very clearly extending from the political argument, from the political sphere towards the social and economic spheres within the country, as well, as was very clearly shown by the establishment of this particular forum. And then after the October and November elections that same autumn, a new cabinet, the 18th cabinet of the Republic of Lithuania, was sworn in, and quite famously it proclaimed that this forum foreign policy would be based on values. And in the initial coalition agreement among the three center-right political forces, because in this regard we're dealing with the center-right government, within their initial coalition agreement, there was a pledge to actually support human rights and liberal democracy from Belarus to Taiwan. So Taiwan was put in the coalition agreement verbatim, so basically as the actual word, though within the governmental program, there was no mention of Taiwan. Be that as it may, however, since the beginning of the following year, the year 2021, very clear-cut official developments started in terms of the new government's approach towards the cross-strait relations in general and the country's relationship with Taiwan in particular. But what has to be emphasized in this regard is that China's pressure on Lithuania is not only about Taiwan. So quite contrary to this common understanding of the problem, particularly outside of the country, but also to pretty large, substantial degree within Lithuania as well. It was not only about Taiwan. Actually, the new government's approach to the relationship with China included quite a lot of topics, and the new government actually started not from Taiwan. The single most important move before the actual declaration about the opening of the Taiwanese representative office was obviously about Lithuania's withdrawal from the 17+1 format. And in this regard, Lithuania attempted to pursue a soft exit. So basically, Lithuania was not willing to damage the Chinese mianzi, to damage the Chinese perception of self-righteousness and the so-called phase. But by the end of spring, it became rather official that Lithuania had already withdrawn from the framework, because before that, Lithuania was not really willing to emphasize that outright, to emphasize that openly. And then in the middle of that same year, in the mid-summer and mid-July, the Taiwanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it declared that it was about to open its representative office in Lithuania, and the Lithuanian MFA soon confirmed that. And the whole relationship bit by bit entered the actual crisis mode. But yet again, we have to emphasize that the build-up for Chinese means of economic and not only economic pressure actually started even earlier, though it was in late summer, in the second half of summer, that the most clear-cut manifestations of that would be pressure of the actual unified campaign to initiate pressure on Lithuania were already visible. We have to remember that pressure was not only economic, though this happens to be the issue that is usually emphasized to the largest degree. It also involved a very clear-cut diplomatic pressure, also unprecedented to quite a large degree. You're probably well aware that Lithuania had to, in effect, evacuate its embassy from Beijing. So Lithuania still has its embassy technically, but it works in Vilnius. And the Chinese side unilaterally decided that the relationship would be based on the level of the Shachshed effect, which, according to the international diplomatic practices, the Vienna Convention, according to the laws of the Republic of Lithuania, is something that could not have happened. So one had to have Lithuania's agreement for this to actually occur, and that kind of agreement was never gotten, to say the least. As far as economic measures are concerned, yet again, we have to remember that this was not only about bilateral pressure. So the interest in the Lithuanian case study across much of the world is primarily associated with China's willingness to pursue economic coercion against Lithuania by unprecedented means. And in this regard, we're obviously meaning targeting the global supply chains. by targeting the Lithuanian components within the exports of other third countries in this regard. Thus, this dispute turned to be obviously a matter of the European Union single market and actually a matter of the international trade and economic order in and of itself. But we have to also emphasize that the first traces of would-be secondary sanctions through the supply chains actually occurred as early as August 2021, so way before the actual opening of the representative office, which quite obviously occurred in the second half of November of that same year. At that time, several indications turned to be public about pressure by the Chinese authorities on a major American biotech company that happens to be a very important player in Lithuania as well. So not only in China, but in Lithuania as well. So apparently the Chinese authorities attempted to kind of initiate pressure on that company to de-invest from the country, and that particular American company decided not to do so, and thus far it has not done so, which is obviously a good thing from the perspective of Lithuania. By the end of the year, the full scale of Chinese advance turned to be apparent to all, and probably the vast majority of you are well versed in the actual data when it came to that. The trade volume between Lithuania and China, it dipped some 90% in December 2021 in comparison to December the previous year, and in comparison to November that same year. So in effect, a very substantial part of bilateral trade was obliterated. Contrary to the former manifestations of Chinese economic statecraft, former precedents of Chinese economic statecraft against Lithuania, and Lithuania has admittedly a pretty rich history of those. This time, China decided to target not only the secondary actors, not only the third actors, and not only the supply chains, but the imports to Lithuania, which obviously proved to be a major issue for our manufacturing sector as well. So in general, the Chinese response proved to be rather hurtful. So our national regulator, financial regulator, the Bank of Lithuania, made estimates in the beginning of the year that basically said, according to which Lithuania would lose, well, and it depended on the actual level of escalation, but if the country would see de-investment attempts by the third actors, say by other fellow Western multinational companies from Lithuania, it might be a very troublesome issue. It might produce a very troublesome outcome for Lithuania, akin to a decrease of the country's GDP growth by some 1.3% at least. But again, calculating this kind of data is tremendously difficult because actually, to be honest, quite a lot of Lithuanian exporters were actually surprised by the fact that their components eventually ended up in China at all. So this happens to be a very curious case in point that highlights the difficulty to actually trace the supply chains worldwide, and this is something that also attracts the attention by the international community to the Lithuanian case study at this particular point. Now, speaking of the actual reasons behind the Chinese are, you're probably well aware of the naming issue. Right, the Chinese were very much unhappy about the fact that the Lithuanians allowed for the representative office to be opened with this nameplate, which mentions the Taiwanese in the English language and also in Lithuanian language whenever that is in the official Lithuanian documents. But yet again, if one would take a look at the Chinese translation of that, Chinese version of that, here written in traditional characters that are that are invoked in Taiwan. So there are those two characters of the actual island depicted there. And admittedly, this is indeed a future that might be considered from the perspective of Beijing as a major status quo change, not only in terms of its relationship with Lithuania, but in terms of its relationship with the rest of the world in general. So this is something that we also have to be frank about. But yet again, if we would remember that the Chinese pressure campaign actually started way before that, way before the nameplate, and way before the actual Taiwanese decision on the matter. So this allows us to put the whole story into quite a different perspective. Now, the fourth point in this regard is probably one of the most important for us, particularly as far as the would-be discussion is concerned, is that China's actions are rather counterproductive, at least thus far, from the perspective of Lithuania, from the perspective of the European Union, and I would argue the Western world as well. And we have to admit that in the end of 2021 and the sure beginning of this year, the Lithuanian political and economic elites, they were wavering. So particularly under the conditions of the so-called secondary sanctions, when Western multinationals, our very important partners and friends, started to kind of question our decision, criticize it rather openly. So criticism of this approach towards Taiwan, of this general change, shift in our relationship towards the People's Republic as well, it turned to be in vogue within the current country's public and political debate. But somewhat later on, a new push for this policy was produced, and this had to do primarily with rather clear-cut, not only rhetorical, but also very much actual support coming from fellow Western countries, coming from fellow Western partners. And in this regard, we quite obviously have to mention the European Union, along with its first rhetorical support, then later on its initiative with the so-called anti-coercion instrument, and ending up with the actual filing of the case to the WTO on behalf of Lithuania and on behalf of the European Union and its single market, which also has to be emphasized. Then the American support came a little bit earlier, but from the perspective of Lithuania in this particular regard, the European Union support was probably more significant, because yet again the whole thing caused quite a lot of problems in our relationships with fellow EU members, some of them, not all, however, and quite a lot of support from Taiwan also came, and this is something that is probably of particular interest to us. In the later case, support was both societal, and there is an increasing talk throughout these last several months about about Lithuanian fashion, right? About Lithuanian moment in Taiwan, which is very much associated with consumer behavior, for example, among the Taiwanese. But even more importantly, since the beginning of this year, we have to recognize the fact that the Taiwanese government is also willing to help us officially. An investment fund worth some 200 million United States dollars was proclaimed first, then an extra fund worth some 1 billion United States dollars for joint ventures between the Taiwanese and Lithuanian economic actors was proclaimed. Then only several weeks ago, the news emerged about the creation of a joint scientific center for semiconductors and fellow material research. And the latest developments were very much associated with the security crisis ongoing not far away from us, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So the Taiwanese actually pledged 500,000 United States dollars for Lithuania's Red Cross in order to precisely help the Ukrainian refugees, and with obviously witnessing an increasing amount of them coming into the country on a daily basis. This brings me to the last point about the collateral impact of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And as you are probably well aware, Lithuania happens to be one of the most vocal supporters of Ukraine throughout decades, and particularly since Maidan and then Euromaidan. So it happens to be the case with Sweden actually as well. But we're also witnessing a very interesting development that the Taiwanese are also very much supportive. And the main reason, one of the main reasons in this regard is obviously that we're seeing quite a lot of connections, and that Sino-Russian relationship, it is something that makes all of us nervous in this regard. So this brings me to the tentative conclusions. And the first being that the 2021 breakthrough of bilateral ties or de facto relations between Lithuania and Taiwan should not be perceived as isolated from other and longer and earlier trends, especially in Sino-Lithuanian relations, but also in terms of general international relations. Particularly, this is something that the Lithuanian government would like to very much emphasize, particularly in terms of the relationships between the Western liberal democratic part of the world, or liberal democratic part of the world to be more precise, and the major authoritarian countries, particularly in this regard, China and Russia. And China's economic coercion should also be viewed as part of a much broader critical trend. And we have to emphasize that the Lithuanian case study is not only important for the Western countries, for the European Union, for the international trade system, it is very important for China. And actually the Chinese media outlets and even some of the officials, they were rather open in terms of suggesting that what has been done to Lithuania is their response to the secondary sanctions, the way they would call it, by the United States of America imposed particularly during the Trump administration, with all of the negative repercussions, say for the Sino-American and Sino-Canadian and in general Sino-Western relations. So this is something that I would argue the Chinese side is very much aware of as well. And the last point is that Russo-Ukrainian full-scale war and obviously China's reaction to it has further shored up a sense of vindication and democratic entitlement among quite a lot of Lithuanians, particularly the key decision makers at this point. So this brings me to the end. Please excuse me if I've overextended myself a bit. Thank you.
Thank you kindly for this very enlightening presentation. You touched upon so many points, but I think they're all so very valid. So just to remind our audience, you can post your questions in the Q&A function below. We already have two, but before we do that, I do have a question myself. Since you elaborated on the reasons for Taiwan becoming so prominent in Lithuanian foreign policy again, I was wondering what's the role of the EU in all of this? Is there any ulterior motive on Lithuania's side, so to speak, to step up now and to have a certain say in this? Or what do you think is the EU's role in all of that?
That is indeed a very good question. Thank you, Larissa. We have to emphasize several things in this regard. The first being quite obvious is that many actors within the European Union, within the member states, particularly those who happen to work with economic matters, they were pretty unhappy about Lithuania's decision, and Lithuania should be very much frank about the fact that it unwillingly caused quite a lot of problems for our friends and partners by doing this. But Lithuania is also willing to say in this regard that what Lithuania has been doing since the year 2019 was largely within the remit of a change in terms of the European Union's approach towards the same question. Because just to remind you, since the year 2017 in particular, we have a very clear-cut emergence of a shift within the European Union's position towards its relationship with China, and Taiwan has been increasingly popping up in the EU's official documents since 2017, but particularly since the year 2019. So actually before Lithuania initiated the whole thing, quite some of the European actors, particularly on the political, within the political sphere, they had already started talking about this. So this is something that we also have to emphasize. The Lithuanian perception is that it follows the general trend, but at the same time, being a small country in a very troublesome security environment, it also feels those changes ongoing within the international environment very intimately. And it's the first to feel those changes. And thus sometimes it might look as if we're kind of, doing our own thing, but in effect, we are following the general developments, but we are probably the ones that manage for some reason or another, but probably yet again, this has a lot to do with our very peculiar situation, peculiar geography, peculiar history, that we managed to identify those things a little bit earlier. And this is something that can be extended to our perception on Russia, because for us, it is the I told you so moment as far as obviously the Russian foreign policy making and also domestic politics is concerned to a pretty large degree. So I'm not sure whether that answers your question, but I believe that other fellow questions would also raise this topic in one way or another. So I would extend on that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It very much answers the question. I mean, it's a very broad question, so there's, I guess, a lot to discuss in the end. But since you mentioned the historical part, we have a question from Torbjørn Lodén, who says, thank you for your very illuminating lecture. In the early 1990s, Latvia recognized the ROC for a short period of time. Was there at any time of Lithuania's rebirth after the long period of Soviet rule, any discussion in the country about recognizing the ROC?
That is a very good question indeed. A colleague of mine, Raigardas Borta, has just made a presentation at the international conference that basically deals with the different approaches by the Baltic states in the 1990s towards the cross-strait relations. And obviously, the neighboring brotherly nation of Latvia was pursuing a pretty idiosyncratic and pretty peculiar path, but actually it was rather rapidly stopped by the Chinese, and in terms of doing so, and apparently the fellow Western governments, our would-be partners and allies, they were also not really willing to kind of raise this additional issue in this particular part of Europe back in the day, and eventually the Latvians decided to back down. But still, since the early 1990s, the representation for the whole Baltic states region for the three countries by the Taiwanese government was located in Riga. So the office is still there. I'm not sure about their would be motivations and actions, but well, it would be rather obvious that the Taiwanese would be willing to kind of to retain that office as well, and this is something that we obviously would be willing to have as an outcome. But this is something that might bring us towards larger speculations, and this is something that I would obviously not be willing to do. But getting back to the original question, yeah, there were some low-scale debates back in the day about doing this action, but eventually our willingness to enter the international relations system full scale as soon as possible, it ran supreme. And this was the same argument that the Latvians also used, because at that time, again, Lithuania was the first Soviet republic to declare independence. So we were in a rather troublesome situation to begin with, and fellow Soviet republics, they lagged behind in this regard. So we had to be very careful, and this happens to be one of the reasons behind a very important part of the dispute, which has to do with these allegations about the actual act, about the actual declaration that established bilateral relations between Beijing and Vilnius back in the day, and the wording of that declaration, which obviously differs in different languages. It is admittedly somewhat more explicit vis-a-vis what the Chinese would call one China principle, and what the vast majority of other countries, particularly in the West, would call one China policy. It is more explicit than in many other cases of similar treaties being signed by other countries when they established official diplomatic relations with the People's Republic, and quite often this meant the change of the recognition from the Republic of to the People's Republic of China. So this also has to be factored in. There was always a pretty strong anti-communist component within the political elites of the country, and even during the allegedly high points of our relationship, say, for example, when the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, the then president of the country, outgoing president Jiang Zemin, visited Lithuania in the early 2000s, still the problems were produced because quite a lot of Lithuanian politicians, they were willing to kind of highlight the problems with communism, to highlight the plight of ethno-linguistic and ethno-confessional minority groups in China. For us in Lithuania, the usual case in point was the Tibetan question, but throughout these last several years, and due to the developments within the country, obviously the Hong Kongese, the Uyghur questions have also joined this whole matter. And if we would submit ourselves to the perception of Beijing in this regard, the Taiwanese issue also was associated with a similar trend. Thank you.
All right, just staying on this, was dual recognition ever discussed or mentioned?
This is something that I cannot tell outright, but you know, probably we would be willing to do that. Many countries would be willing to do that, but we also do know how this works. There is no way for this to work because China simply says no. I mean, Lithuania would be very much okay with that, and I believe that the vast majority of the international community would be okay with that if both Chinas, so to speak, would pursue the path that both Koreas decided to pursue at the end of the Cold War, right? This is something that would probably be very much conducive to international peace and stability. But this is something that the government in Beijing is considering to be totally off limits for obvious reasons. And please let me emphasize this fact yet again, that the official position of the Republic of Lithuania is that the relationship with Taiwan is non-official, right? It's non-official. So we retain our relationship with the People's Republic of China. We still retain our adherence to the one China policy, the way we see it, the way we interpret it, and we do not see any indications of our country breaching actually the original agreement to establish diplomatic relations between Beijing and Vilnius. This is something that probably has to be emphasized. Yes.
Thank you. Very important to note. Actually, I want to move on. We have another question from Mats Engman, who asks, could you notice any movement in other Western countries to follow the example of Lithuania, apart from just rhetorically supporting Lithuania, of course?
Well, most assuredly, in our region, so to speak, again, our perception of the region might be a little bit different from other fellow countries. And in this regard, let us adhere to the Chinese perception of how our region would look like, right? The former 17 countries or 16 aside of Greece, which is obviously a Southern European countries. We do definitely feel certain shifts in the countries of Eastern and Central Europe, so to speak. In the fellow Baltic countries, Estonia probably is the most important example in this regard. We can see shifts and Slovakia and the Czech Republic, particularly since the latest elections that brought to power the political forces that were rather vocal about the need to kind of review their own relationships with the People's Republic of China. And again, the Czech Republic has a fair share of their own grievances against China associated with the question of Taiwan as well. And quite obviously, we're seeing very important developments in Slovenia as well. I would argue that in the larger context as well, the vast majority of European countries are also witnessing a certain shift. Even the German government is increasingly willing to mention Taiwan in its the current cabinet, the new cabinet, in its official and semi-official discourse, which is obviously a major shift in this regard. So definitely something is going on, and I believe that these developments that we're having in Europe, to be more precise, would probably contribute to this recognition of the need to have better relations with Taiwan among the member states and within the European Union as well. If we would take a look at the latest EU communication, it also specifies the need to have better de facto kind of relations. You know, the actual wording, it tends to differ with Taiwan as well. So the shift is there, but it is way gradual than that in Lithuania. And from the perspective of those respective governments and from the perspective of Brussels, which is this happens to be a very logical response, I would argue.
Staying on this, we have a question from Jagannath Panda. What are the alternative strategic choices or options for Lithuania to strengthen ties in Asia beyond Taiwan?
That is a very good question, actually. The one that I failed to emphasize, though I should have back in the day, the position of the government of Lithuania, particularly the current cabinet, but the whole talk actually began under the tenure of the previous government, is about the need of diplomatic, economic, etc., political, and even security diversification in the Indo-Pacific. So it has to do with the strengthening of our already existing trade and economic relationships with those partners, in particular in which we do have diplomatic presence, such as Japan, such as India. In particular, those countries are key for us in Asia. The Foreign Minister Gabrielius Landsbergis, right, when the new government was elected, so Landsbergis, who was one of the co-authors of that op-ed I mentioned previously, became the foreign minister of the country, while Mantas Adomėnas became his deputy, right? So those figures actually became the key decision makers in terms of the country's foreign policy making. So Gabrielius Landsbergis even went as far as saying last summer that the most important partner in Asia for Lithuania is Japan, which was a very notable recognition, because previously Lithuania was not really willing to kind of emphasize this kind of role and to make these stark choices. But yet again, this was very natural considering the developments. So from the perspective of the Lithuanian government, our Taiwanese move, right, our Taiwanese initiative happens to be part and parcel of the general diversification in the Indo-Pacific strategy, and Lithuania is in the process of opening its embassies in South Korea, in Seoul, in Australia, in Canberra, in Singapore as well, and in Taipei. De facto, quite obviously, representative office. It has already opened embassies in some of those countries. In Singapore, I believe it is still upcoming, but this is part and parcel of the general trend. The Lithuanian perspective is that it is way more secure, that at the end of the day, it is way more pragmatic to have better working, stable economic, not only political and security, but also economic relationships with what Lithuania would deem to be like-minded countries. This is the narrative of the like-minded countries. Quite obviously, one might criticize certain of our decisions. Singapore, again, might be called a liberal democracy with a huge stretch. admittedly so, but still, it's very far away from increasingly harshly authoritarian China, and there are quite a lot of perspectives that Lithuania is eyeing for in Singapore and the rest of Southeast Asia as well. Lithuania perceives Singapore as the natural gateway to Southeast Asia in the same vein as it pursues New Delhi, the natural gateway to South Asia as well. So that was a very pertinent question. Thank you for highlighting that.
Great, thank you so much. And now back to more domestic issues, maybe. We have a question from Sean King, who asks, can you please explain Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda's Taiwan regret comments in January?
That is a very good comment. Again, this brings me to the point about a certain high point of the criticism within the country's domestic politics, and obviously the remark by our president was something that probably emphasized this particular point to the highest degree. So what happened back in the day was that our president had an interview with a local media outlet, and the interview was in general about a lot of domestic and foreign policy issues. And then the journalist, she kind of pressed him towards this position of actually giving a finite answer about his position on Taiwan. And he said that opening the office with this nameplate, using this name, was a mistake. And probably there were no expectations of this to become a major story abroad, and it definitely has become one for obvious reasons, quite naturally. So I would argue that this was part of a slip of a tongue, but it was also part of a more general trend. And we have to be frank about the fact that since the late particularly since the late November, when the amount of Chinese economic pressure, the amount of Chinese economic coercion against Lithuania started to become apparent, the amount of criticism it jumped to a very large degree. So the decision was criticized by former presidents of the country, who happened to be considered were very patriotic and, basically caring for the country's national interests. The decision was criticized quite obviously by the political opposition, but yet again, this is something that we should expect from the political opposition. This is their job, right? And it's good that they're doing this job. A very important development was that the decision got criticized by some of our industrial sectors. And the key in this regard was the laser industry, which are considered to be poster boys within the country's economy in general, very patriotic, very respected figures, and they criticized the decision very harshly. But from their perspective, it was an overall problem, because a very substantial part of their exports went to China. They were very much dependent on the imports from China, the components as well, and quite obviously they were also very much integrated within the global supply chains as well. So this proved to be a very troublesome decision for them on all of those scales. But yet again, the remark by the president was part and parcel of this more general trend, because at that time, in late November, in December, and in early January, the support by fellow Western countries, but particularly by the European Union member states and Brussels itself, was rather rhetorical. So at that time, Lithuania was really unsure whether the Western governments would support Lithuania. The only government that did that, not only symbolically, not only rhetorically, but for very concrete and major measures, was the United States government, because the agreement on the kind of facilitating Lithuanian exports was signed as early as September, I believe, 2021. But by the mid-January, the situation has changed pretty drastically, and after the kickstart of this latest stage of war between Russia and Ukraine, again, there is this sense of vindication. And at the same time, the current government, which is criticized very much for many of various decisions, which is natural considering the nature of this last several years. The government is also criticized for its pandemic alleviation measures, etc. But this also happens to be the government that criticized Russia to the largest possible degree. And again, there is this certain sense of vindication. So I believe that the prospects for this government are way better than they were some 2 to 3, even more so, 3 months ago. A very important thing that has to be added in this regard was the lack of popular support for the policy. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs itself made the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and later on the major media and poll services made several polls of among the Lithuanians. So basically, attempting to assess the Lithuanian perception on the policy shift towards China, and the vast majority of Lithuanians, they disagreed with the whole matter. But we also have to remember that this has a lot to do with the general criticism of this government that derives from other factors, that derives from the migrant crisis facilitated by Belarus, which proved to be a major security issue, that derives from the pandemic, that derives from the cultural wars, well, not really wars, but conflicts in our country pertaining to many various different issues which are still in place. So I would argue that we have to await for later polls to come, because the Russian aggression, it also highlights the counterproductive role of China to quite a lot of Lithuanians, decision makers, members of the economic political elites. And I would strongly argue that the general population within the country would also experience a certain shift on their perspective on China as well as a result of these developments.
Thank you so much. I think there's going to be a lot coming up in the coming years, so we will have to return to this. But you mentioned EU support, or maybe the lack thereof. We have a question from Zach Nan, who says the EU recently launched a case at the World Trade Organization over China's alleged targeting of goods from Lithuania over Vilnius' relationship with Taiwan. What is your view on the nature of this decision? Does it represent a fundamental shift at EU level on Sino-EU relations? And depending on the final outcome, what do you think might be the long-term effect?
Well, correct. This is a very important development that the European Union decided to do so. And I mean, it was all natural for the European Union to do so, because it's not only about Lithuania. The EU has a fair share of its own problems with China. That have a lot to do with trade protectionism, with unfair practices, with the lack of level playing field. And this Lithuanian precedent, it gives a very good chance kind of for the European Union to try to actually negotiate a way out of the general problematic trade and investment relationship with the People's Republic these days. Another important thing that has to be emphasized yet again, that this bid was actually joined by a very important group of countries: the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, Taiwan as well joined this bid, joined the actual filing. And this is an immense level of support that we are seeing as well. Lithuania is very much aware of the fact that it's an EU issue, right? Lithuania was not really willing to bring the EU to this position, but this is something that the Sino-EU relationship would eventually find themselves in any case, because yet again there is a huge amount of other negative topics in this regard as well. Lithuania is also very much aware of the fact that the whole dispute settling mechanism is a very problematic issue. There are organizational problems actually associated with the United States, with the previous administration by Donald Trump, the lack of the US practical support for the WTO mechanism. And then there is the judicial part of the whole story that is going to be a long story. So from the perspective of Lithuania, the key for us today is obviously to help our businesses to help our economic actors in short to medium term. This is what is important to us. The level of our economic relationships with China is actually very small. China can hurt us, it hurts us, but it hurts us primarily through the supply chains. So if we manage to deal with this problem, Lithuania would recover. We need to help our businesses, those businesses which were primarily working with the Chinese market. We do have a fair share of those, but yet again, Lithuania would recover. And this is something that we also have to remember. I would even argue that the Chinese needs, say, for wheat or other agricultural products in these upcoming months would strongly suggest that it would be way better for them to reestablish better relations with quite a lot of foreign countries, including Lithuania, which is a small but still quite important provider of agricultural produce to the global markets. That was a good question, though.
I mean, that brings me pretty much to we have to wrap up at this point. We've reached our hour, but I would be keen to hear from you. You already touched upon it in your last mention now. How do you see the future of Lithuania's relations with mainland China and Taiwan, let's say, in the coming few years?
Much more depends on the domestic political developments in China and in Taiwan as well. We also have to be realistic that Taiwan, functions as a liberal democracy, and Kuomintang government might have different views on the activity of their country on the international sphere. Maybe they would deem the Lithuanian option to be too provocative, and maybe they themselves would be willing to kind of downgrade their relationship as such. A lot of depends on China as well, because China is also in a pretty sensitive period throughout these last several years for obvious reasons. There is the upcoming Communist Party Congress, the 20th Congress, and Xi Jinping is apparently very much willing to extend his tenure of the general secretary beyond the normal limits. So the situation is very tense at the moment in China, and again, the security crisis in Europe would not alleviate that, would only further contribute to the whole thing. Lithuania, I would argue, is very much aware of the fact that that getting back to the status quo ante in terms of our relationship with China is impossible. We are very much aware of the fact that we have indeed hurt the feelings of quite a lot of officials, and even probably the Chinese population at large, though it is rather unfortunate. We would definitely not be willing to do so, but this is something that has to do with the authoritarian nature of the system, and how the information actually transcends from the political elites to the society within the People's Republic. We are realistic that return to the status quo ante fully is not possible. We very much want to pursue workable official relations with China, but we also see it as a potential problem and as a potential threat. That dependency on China, on the Chinese economy, it has very negative repercussions for particularly liberal democratic countries' sovereignty, for their security, and this is very clearly shown by those more important, more powerful countries that have deeper economic relations either with China or Russia these days, and those difficult choices that they have to make. Their choices are way more difficult than our choices, but part of the reason is that we were quintessentially more skeptical about dealing with those countries to begin with.
All right, thank you so much. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today, for your very good insights. And I assume it's also going to depend on what comes out of the semiconductor negotiations currently ongoing. So perhaps we should revisit this topic at some point, and then you're more than welcome back. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for your questions.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for your questions as well.
Thank you, and have a good day, everyone. So bye.